Good evening. Good evening. My name is David Theo Goldberg. I direct the University of California Humanities Research Institute, and with Mimi Ito, we co-direct the MacArthur Digital Media and Learning Research Hub based at the University of California, Irvine. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the beginning of the first, we hope, annual Digital Media and Learning Conference. It's intended to be annual. When we started putting this together, we predicted about 120 people, thought there might be about 150 who would register, and prepared ourselves for the deluge. The deluge showed up, right? So we have something like 500 registrants over the next 2 days. And obviously we're trying to accommodate everybody as best we can. So please do bear with us. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all. We've been saying that we've been building the field of digital media and learning. I think we've reached a point, and this is evidence of it, that we're no longer so much building the field as the field has arrived upon us. And that requires us to think probably a little bit differently, and so this conference will be addressing that set of questions. The theme for the 2 days is diversifying participation. There's an obvious way to read that, opening up participation to diversity, but there's also a reverse way, or a number of reverse ways of reading it, so that one has to also engage in participatory diversity or participating in diversity, and I think those kinds of meanings should be held open as well. Having said all that, I want to welcome you all. I hope you're all comfortable and will remain so. You'll be challenged in the next couple of days to think anew about this emergent or now existent field of digital media and learning. And having said that, I want to thank a number of people. First and foremost, the MacArthur Foundation for actually having the courage to wade in. And you'll hear in a minute from Connie Yau, the Director of Education at the MacArthur Foundation. But there's a sense in which none of us would be here today, meeting here in the space, were it not for them. I want to thank also Cal IT2 here on this campus, particularly Larry Smar, the overall director, who has made these fabulous facilities available to us to meet over the next couple of days and has done everything to accommodate us and all our needs associated. And then I just want to thank my interlocutors, partners, collaborators in putting this all together. Mimi Ito, who I saw walk in the door a moment ago, who has been fabulous in helping head this up. Heather Horst especially, who has been tireless in defining and putting together the program, and who really, on whose shoulders this has been built in a very material kind of way. And then, without naming them, all our staff at UCHRI and the Digital Media and Learning Research Hub. I hope I've left nobody out. We will name people later on in order to thank them a little bit more formally. And of course, I want to thank Henry Jenkins for agreeing so graciously to be chair. I mean, he's unbelievably taxed in terms of his time and has been terrific in thinking us through the process of getting to the program we've managed to put together for you. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce Connie Yau, the Director of Education for the MacArthur Foundation and our fearless leader in digital media and learning. Connie.
Good evening, everybody. I'll be very, very brief and get out of the way quickly. It's my job tonight just to take a couple of moments to gush about how wonderful it is to have this event. As some of you know, we launched the Digital Media and Learning Initiative about 4 years ago, and I remember that the small number of us could fit in a modest-sized room at the foundation when we had our first annual grantee meeting. And it's just fantastic to be here tonight to an oversubscribed first annual Digital Media and Learning Conference. It's just absolutely terrific. I've looked over the agenda for the conference, and it just seems absolutely fantastic and really just shows how far we've grown in the last 4 years, from starting with a very simple question about wondering whether or not young people are learning differently as a result of digital media, to now really being in position to start thinking about and working on having the impact and influence to change what learning looks like in the 21st century. And I really feel like we're at a moment in time where we have an administration in the United States where there's a window that's open to really reimagine what learning might look like in the United States. And there's sort of an open conversation and dialogue that's going on right now. And as I look out at the audience here, and as I look at the topics and the breadth of what's going to be discussed over the next 2 days, I feel like we have at this conference the folks who are really the best prepared to begin to answer that question and to really have a huge influence on reimagining the education and learning for our children in the 21st century. So I'm thoroughly excited to learn from you all over the next couple of days and to engage in some extraordinary conversations. And I too want to thank the staff from the DML Research Hub, Mimi and David and Heather, and everybody from the group have just done a terrific job in putting this event together. And thank you, Henry, for being the chair for the first annual. It's so appropriate to have you be the chair for this event. I can't thank you enough for that. So thank you all for coming, and I'm looking forward to just a fantastic conversation. Thanks very much.
Since you've both been everyone's been welcome twice now, let me say welcome a third time. My function here is twofold. The first is I'm supposed to deliver some provocations about diversifying participation for about 10 minutes, and then I'm going to turn it over to our real speaker this evening, Craig Watkins, and sort of offer a few words of introduction. On the eve of getting ready to come down here, I found myself rereading a number of works by John Fiske, who was my mentor in graduate school. And this is a year where Fiske's contribution to the field is being commemorated by a conference at Madison and the reissue of his books. And I was reading it with a growing sense of strangeness, because Fiske was writing in the late 80s, early 90s, and he talked a lot about the art of making do. And the language of that time was one of resistance, that is, knowing that we do not control the means of cultural production and distribution, how do people carve out a space for themselves, for their cultural identities in relation to the technological environment that surrounds them? And as I was reading through this, I finally got to his last book, Media Matters, which is written it comes out just early in the Clinton administration years. And there's a kind of just beginning to see the emergence of a possibility that, in fact, we don't just take from the existing culture and remix it, but that we actually are able to create and circulate our own stuff. And so I want to pose that notion of the art of making do against where we are now, where we are increasingly part of what I call a participatory culture, where we have transformed the tools of cultural production and distribution so that many more people than ever before are able to create things and share things with each other. We all know the numbers the Pew Center has produced year after year, showing gradual increases, but significant increases in our ability to participate. What the MacArthur work has done, I think, has demonstrated that that participatory culture is a valuable environmental ecosystem. And it's true whether we talk about it as digital media and learning, whether we talk about it as affinity spaces, whether we talk about it as I do participatory culture. There are things going on there that are very powerful, that reinforce learning, that enable people to grow in distinctive ways. And that means it's a powerful resource in school and out that we really want to be concerned with. Increasingly, I hear the word participatory culture get collapsed in with Web 2.0, right? And I want to guard. I vigilantly try to guard against the blurring of those two things, that Web 2.0 is a business model. It describes a particular way of capital around the distribution of culture. Those tools that are called Web 2.0 tools play a very important role in enabling us to share media and form social networks. But to collapse the two together is to ignore a history that is much older than the history of the web. So increasingly, I've been asking people to go back to Web -10. right, to talk about that history, which is Web Negative 10 for me was a period in the 1850s, 1860s, the beginnings of the Amateur Press Association in the United States. So something Paula Petrie has written about, some very interesting things. That high school age kids were taking toy printing presses and laying out type and printing out zines which circulated across the country. And they formed virtual communities or social networks with each other to share and exchange those ideas. Now, I keep thinking about my characters on Twitter and 155 characters and how long it would take to set 155 pieces of type, letter by letter, just to print out the tweet that I put out this morning. But the power of these young people to form this network. What's fascinating is that they immediately turned it to both participation in popular culture and to civic participation. They were discussing popular stories and they were discussing the issues of the day. And the space turns out to be contested but diverse, which is to say that Paula Petrie's account describes African American editors who fought to be included in the Amateur Press Association and were ultimately won space in the 1860s to be part of that, and talks about female editors struggling to be accepted but gaining acceptance in the Amateur Press Association of the 1860s. So there was a struggle there around this technology to allow diverse participation to take place and to enable a community to grow. Now, of course, this is written out of the history of communications, as have successive generations. We can trace an almost unbroken chain of participatory culture embracing new technologies, incorporating into its practices, and fighting over issues of diversity from that period to the present. The fascinating thing is, because they had to set the type by hand, they used abbreviations, and one of the abbreviations was LOL, laugh out loud. So in fact, we think of that as the marking the digital generation, but it actually goes back to about 1860. So that history of the participation, I think, is a vital one for us to keep in mind because it reminds us of a struggle that's gone on to ensure diversity and participation and to enable the democratization of communication in this country. And it's one that we have to pay attention to. Now, often when we talk about the challenge over the last two decades, the challenge has been framed in terms of a digital divide. And the digital divide is about information haves and have-nots, and it's mostly got framed in terms of access to technology. And in my own work, I push beyond that to think about the participation gap, which is about access to social skills, cultural competencies, cultural capital, social networks, time, all of the things that block us from being able to blocks people from being able to fully participate in this new participatory culture. And those of us who believe in the value of participatory culture have to be concerned with those blockages. But it's also increasingly clear that we can't just sum this up as a binary, that either you're in the digital or you're out of the digital. There's, in fact, diverse forms of participation and diverse forms of blockages. There are multiple insides and there are multiple outsides. And I'm hoping that as we deal with the issues this weekend, we can explore those ways that people are allowed in and still may be marginalized. There are messages may be decontextualized. They may be user moderation may allow the best to rise to the top, and the best turns out to be white male content, and the rest of it gets filtered out. We should be concerned with the sort of digital enclaves that Cass Sunstein talks about, but also the gated communities that Craig Watkins and Dana Boyd have talked about, that these are issues that we have to have front and center as we think about how we ensure diversity of participation. I'm interested increasingly in circulation as well as production, and the question of how messages go awry, how messages get blocked, how messages get reinterpreted and decontextualized in this new environment seems really crucial to that. So I'll begin by talking about Fisk, and Fisk in that final essay he wrote for Media Matters talked about the Rodney King tape, right? And he describes this as a moment where the population has access to tools and cameras of counter-surveillance in which they can record the police, and that those messages have high authenticity and high credibility because they're so primitive in their technological capacity. And then he describes the way those messages get picked up by the defense at the Rodney King trial and recontextualized, reworked, transformed high-tech. And so he talked about high-tech and low-tech. He talked about the two as different levels of credibility, as a techno struggle that we would increasingly face as we move forward between different layers of cultural production and who's included, who's excluded in that. And Fisk, who's often accused of being a blind optimist, a naive optimist, ends that essay with the statement that we now have new opportunities to struggle. And I find that a really telling phrase, new opportunities to struggle for participation, for access to ideas, for the democratization of society. That Fisk, at that moment, doesn't describe utopia, doesn't describe, as we've seen increasingly, digital rhetoric sort of suggests that the technology gives us things on a silver platter. He says we have new opportunities to struggle. And I think this weekend we are here to struggle. We're here to ask questions. That when we set up this paper call, we had several things in mind. One was that we would broaden the network around MacArthur by bringing in voices and perspectives that we didn't necessarily hear already, and that we would hear about projects that didn't necessarily look like what we would see. Another was we wanted to challenge people to move from very general constructs of the reader, the user, the learner that often sort of stripped away cultural particularity and insist on getting to very particular case studies and very particular accounts of diverse cultures of learning and cultural production. And we wanted to challenge the established leaders of this field to question and drill down on their own practices to see what roles diversity and participation played in their work and how we can all be dedicated to work that much harder to ensure the diversification of the digital space. I think the proposals we got in match that challenge. I think people here have come here ready to engage in that conversation. So let us seize this opportunity for struggle and think about the future together of where digital technology can go. So that said, it's my pleasure to introduce S. Craig Watkins, whose work I've long admired. I appreciated his work on technology when he was writing about the hip-hop communities and about alternative ways that people were producing and circulating sounds in our society. And I really got excited when, a while ago when I read his new book, The Young and the Digital, What the Migration, the Social Network Sites, Games, and Anytime, Anywhere Media Means for Our Future, because he was asking hard questions. You know, yes, he has some really positive things to say about the role of media in the lives of young people, things that resonated with my own work, but he also asked hard questions that made me sweat a little, that made me question some of my own assumptions, that challenged some of the easygoing rhetoric that I was used to hearing back at my old job, and sort of began, and that conversation, I think, is one that he's productively continuing to carry on. He's participated in the MacArthur Foundation's book series, and he's now launched a new digital media research initiative that focuses on the use and evolution of social media platforms. And I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say today on living on the digital margins, how Black and Latino youth are remaking the participation gap. So let me turn it over to Craig.
The mic working? Okay, great. Okay. A fourth set of thank yous. Thank you, Henry, for the invitation to come and participate in this program tonight. Also to Heather and Mimi and just David and the entire DML Hub for organizing this pretty incredible event. I know that the buzz has just been building and building and building. And so we're finally here, and the moment has kind of arrived. And Connie, thanks to you and MacArthur for the work that you've been doing. I thought I would start out tonight by actually going back 10 or 12 years or so, 1998. And what I want to do is just to sort of imagine for a brief moment, right? If we were to have held this conference, Diversifying Participation, back in 1998, what it may have been like. What the conversation may have been predominantly, what the panels, what the papers may have been predominantly. In all likelihood, as Henry sort of alluded to, many of us may have been sort of responding to this kind of scenario, this graph here. In particular, this sort of gap in between white household internet access vis-a-vis what Black and Latino households were doing. And in many respects, this would have been sort of the technology gap that sort of has evolved into this thing called the digital divide narrative. And in particular, many of us may have been focusing on this question of access, right? Building access, closing this technology gap, this technology-rich, technology-poor distance here. So if you see here from the, following through the net report in 1998, the third installment of this report had been released, and still the concern, even from the 1995 initial report, was this question of access, and in particular the sort of widening gap between blacks, Latinos, and their white counterparts. Fast forward to today, and to sort of think what the conversations will be about over the next 2 days. Very different environment, very different landscape, very different sort of digital media culture that we will be talking about over the next couple of days or so. And in many respects, much of what we'll be talking about are the sort of energetic and sort of enthusiastic ways in which populations and communities that we have not historically associated, right, with being technologically savvy, or even interested in technology, or even capable of manipulating, playing with, and experimenting with technology, will be kind of at the center and the core of what a lot of us will be talking about. So if you look at the list of papers and panels and presentations scheduled for the next 2 days, it's about communities and populations that just 5, 10, 15 years ago would never have even been sort of fully considered, right, as players in the technology landscape and experience that we're all aware of today. So in other words, the conversation has changed. And the conversation has changed because the ways in which young people in particular are using technology has changed, and more specifically, some of the examples that I want to talk about tonight are the ways in which Black and Latino youth are sort of remaking not only the access gap, but are also beginning to remake the participation gap in ways that are quite exciting, and also in ways that are quite perilous at the same time. And sort of thinking out loud about that is part of what I'd like to try to do today. So we're here January 2010. Some of you may be familiar with the Kaiser Family Foundation. In 1999, released its first Kids in Media report, looking at 8 to 18-year-olds. And it's sort of interesting just to see how the Kaiser's results and their findings in terms of how young people are using media, the degree of engagement, the intensity of their engagement with media has evolved just since 1999. So in their most recent report, we see a picture in which young people are almost throughout the entire day, right, engaged in interacting with some type of media screen, some type of media gadget of some sort. You know, about 3 or 4 years ago when we started surveying young people about their technology use, we would ask them, for example, questions about their use of social network sites, MySpace, Facebook, and we would ask them, for example, you know, roughly how often, right, throughout the day do you log into Facebook? When we started rethinking that same survey 3 or 4 years later, that question seemed to be somewhat obsolete, right? That question sort of assumed, right, that at certain points of the day they weren't connected. That question sort of assumed that at certain points in the day they weren't always on, not always sort of able to communicate and interact and network with their peers. And we know now, right, that it's just a constant flow, right, of media engagement, community, and networking throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout their lives. And so in this sense, looking at the ways in which Black and Latino youth in particular are sort of saturated with media, multitasking with a variety of different devices, using media in ways that are creating, right, an interesting gap in terms of what they're doing with media compared to what their white counterparts are even doing with media today. The Kaiser Foundation also reports for the first time that Latino and Black youth are actually spending more time online than their white counterparts, right? And just the explosion of what young Latinos are doing with media is a really sort of interesting question, because if you think about where the youth population in this country is going, what Latinos do with media and what Latinos do with technology will determine in large measure what young people overall are doing with media and technology. We know, for example, from the Pew Hispanic Center that 18% of young people between the ages of 16 to 25 are of Latino heritage. We also know from the Pew Hispanic Center that 1 in 5 school children, as well as 1 in 4 newborn, are also Latino heritage as well. And so their influence and their impact, their voice, the ways in which they are now beginning to embrace, right, and use technology in a variety of different ways is something that has not only a profound effect for them, their families, and their communities, but in some ways for all of us in society at large. Most of you, and Henry sort of alluded to this, many of you have probably followed over the years the Pew Internet and American Life Project, which has shed, right, an incredible light on the sort of innovative ways and practices that young people have sort of developed over the last 5 to 10 years or so. Starting right around 2005 with one of the first major reports on teens and technology, they began to show, I think for the first time for many of us, right, that how we had oftentimes thought about technology and how we had oftentimes thought about young people's engagement with technology were in some ways quite different from the reality. The reports are beginning to sort of shed light on the degree to which Black and Latino youth are just as likely as their white counterparts to have a social networking profile. In fact, there's increasing evidence that they're likely even spending more time in social network sites, spending more time creating and sharing content. They're blogging, they're writing, they're posting pictures, they're uploading music videos, they're sharing a whole wealth of content with each other and with their peers. And so in that sense, beginning to sort of think about how these sort of emerging practices in digital media behaviors, again, are sort of redefining how we might think about the participation gap more broadly. A recent report sort of suggested, and we've been doing some of this research in some of the more recent work that we've been doing, looking at young people sort of engaging with mobile media. And we know that mobile is sort of emerging, right, as sort of the preferred platform for young people in this country. So one survey, for example, of sort of urban youth, primarily African American and Latino youth, in 6 of the major urban markets in this country, Atlanta, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York, Los Angeles, for example, found that 92% of the people that, over the 1,500 urban youth that they surveyed, owned a mobile phone. They also found, right, that most of them indicated that within the next year they would be buying a new phone. And in fact, we're hearing that as well in our conversations with young people. It used to be, right, that they were buying phones just for stylistic purposes, for self-presentation and performance, but now they're increasingly buying new phones and upgrading year in and year out for the functionality purposes, right, for expanding the repertoire of activities and things that they're doing with their phones. In fact, the Pew report that I mentioned earlier in January of 2010 indicates, right, there's a sort of interesting mobile gap that's emerging. And it's a gap that we may not have necessarily predicted or anticipated 10 years ago, but it's interesting nevertheless. And that is the degree to which black, particularly African-American youth, are sort of deeply immersed in mobile technologies now and are using it to listen to music, using it to watch video, using it to play games, using it in a variety of ways that suggest that their engagement, that their participation in the mobile and digital media world is evolving at a fairly rapid clip. I oftentimes say that doing the work that we all do in this room, it's kind of a hazardous occupation. Hazardous primarily because this field, this environment, this world is changing so rapidly, so quickly, that just the moment when we think we figured it out, that we think we have it, something else is happening, right, at the very moment that we arrive at that point. And so this idea of sort of being flexible, this idea of sort of being imaginative and open in terms of how we think about these issues is something that has certainly kind of informed my work and the kind of approach that I try to take in terms of thinking about young people's engagement with digital media. So we have a sense, right, that this whole idea of the access gap has kind of closed. We have a sense that in many respects, the ways in which black and Latino youth are using media, in some ways, in ways that far even sort of exceed their white counterparts. But I think the real question, right, that many of us in this room, and certainly myself included, are interested in is what are black and Latino youth doing, right, with all of this media? All of this time that they're spending in front of a screen, all of this time that they're sort of engaging and creating and participating in the digital world, what's really going on, right? And what's really happening? And I want to try to share with you at least some of the things that we're seeing, some of the things that we're observing, and how these elements and how these behaviors are beginning to sort of force us to kind of rethink some of our own sort of initial ideas and thoughts about this landscape. Many of you are probably familiar with the Living and Learning with New Media project that Mimi and Heather and others sort of participated in. A pretty incredible project. In fact, a few of us were talking about it just before the start of this program this evening. What I really like about this particular program is that it takes a very sort of rigorous ethnographic approach to trying to understand young people's engagement with digital media. I oftentimes sort of describe my own work as just sort of diving into the digital trenches. In other words, right, trying to sort of get in there with young people, you know, visiting the destinations that they're visiting online, having conversations with them, talking with them, interviewing them, interacting with them, just participating, right, in the world that they're so immersed in. And when you come up right with a very different kind of perspective. You come up right sort of enriched, you come up in some ways hopeful, in some ways troubled, but nevertheless you come away sort of, you definitely sort of recognizing that this is a world, right, that is riveting, this is a world that is evolving, this is a world that we definitely need to begin to start getting closer to, a world that we need to sort of develop finer tools in terms of understanding. What I like about this project is that they also begin to make some distinctions between how young people are participating in digital media. Rather than sort of glossing over or lumping young people into just a sort of general or generic category, they began to sort of identify very precise ways in which young people are engaging digital media, engaging social media, engaging their peers. And they talk about, on the one hand, for example, a particular genre of participation, let's say, for instance, what they call peer-driven genres of participation. We're all familiar with this in terms of what young people are doing with MySpace, what they're doing with Facebook, the ways in which they're using these tools and using these technologies to communicate with each other, to live out the drama of teen angst and teen life. the ways in which the kind of courtship rituals play out within these spaces and within these milieus. But in other words, right, these are sort of peer-informed kind of learning spaces and environments where they're teaching each other, right, how to manage and how to maneuver within this environment. Really sort of interesting kind of work that's going on here. They also talk about sort of interest-driven genres and forms of participation. Young people who develop a particular hobby, maybe it's sort of game-related, or maybe it's some other topic, some other community, knowledge-based community that they're interested in, and how they're able to sort of carve out a space that sort of encourages and cultivates their knowledge and their participation in that particular sphere. In other words, this project, I think, in some ways has given us a really sort of useful vocabulary and a set of analytical tools to begin to start thinking in more in-depth ways about the different dimensions and degrees of participation that young people are enacting in their digital lives. What we found, not surprisingly, right, is that Black and Latino youth are doing some of the very same things that are identified in this report. We know they're hanging out and they're messing around, right? In fact, they're, in some instances, beginning to spend more time in these environments, therefore giving them greater opportunities to mess around, giving them greater opportunities to hang out. And some of that has to do with the very specific and unique kinds of new media ecologies that they inhabit that are quite different from their white counterparts. And we're just now really beginning to get a sense of that in terms of how young people's leisure lives and how those leisure lives lead to different opportunities, different levels of engagement, different degrees of intensity in terms of their involvement in the digital world. You know, when we, about 3 or 4 years ago, started going into MySpace and looking specifically at Black and Latino youth, it was clear to us, right, that hip-hop was a very sort of central element in terms of how they were engaging in this environment, in terms of how they were behaving in this environment, in terms of how they were using hip-hop, right, as a way in which to express themselves, using hip-hop as a way to sort of construct these sort of online identities that they were creating, very highly performative, right, and sort of aspirational in many kinds of ways that we found quite striking and quite interesting. There's this sort of tradition in hip-hop, and some of you may not be familiar with it, where young sort of hip-hop heads, right, at least back in the day, would always carry pencil and pad with them, right? They were always writing rhymes, carrying those rhymes with them, writing stories, writing poetry, sort of capturing their lives in ways that were quite intimate, in ways that were quite insightful, in ways that really kind of flew beneath the radar in many respects. And we see this sort of happening now in the sort of digital space in terms of how they have turned the digital media environment into a place to sort of write about their lives, as a place to sort of create and to explore and to play around with the kinds of identities that they oftentimes articulate in these sort of digital mediated spaces. I wrote in Hip Hop Matters that in some respects, the digital media landscape has become the new town square in hip hop. When young kids now want to know what's going on with hip hop, when they want to have a serious conversation about violence in their communities, when they want to have a serious conversation about drugs in their communities, when they want to have a serious conversation about the prison industrial complex, right? They don't turn to BET, they don't turn to MTV, they don't open up the magazines, they go online, right? And they find each other and have these conversations. They create forums, they create platforms, they create channels in which they're able to engage in some very interesting and sometimes very stunningly critical and insightful commentary and critique about the world around them. And that's one of the things that we also begin to observe in terms of how they're using the digital and mobile media space as a kind of new town square. Here's a phone from a young woman who we met about a month ago or so, and she was using Twitter, right, as a way of sort of communicating with her friends. And it was interesting that she's doing all kinds of interesting things with Twitter in terms of using it in the ways that many of us are familiar with, sort of updating her status throughout the day, sort of sharing different links and information with her friends. But her initial gateway into Twitter was hip-hop culture, right? She turned on to Twitter in order to follow her favorite hip-hop icons, and that has evolved into a much deeper form of engagement. And this is something that the Living and Learning with Digital Media report was very careful to sort of articulate, right? Though we oftentimes sort of understand messing around and hanging out and young people's engagement with entertainment and media kind of as a waste of time, right? As a way really that's not instructive, nothing going on there that's sort of learning, nothing going on there that's of importance. But in many ways, right, those create gateways and sort of unique opportunities for them to leverage those technologies in other kinds of ways as well. And we certainly see that happening. Right before The Young and the Digital came out, Henry emailed me and said, I'd like to do an interview with you for my blog. And for those of you in this room who've ever done an interview with Henry in this context, you probably experienced what I experienced. You walk away from the interview sort of realizing, you know, I think he just taught me something about my own work. And that was certainly the experience that I had. Henry asked me a whole list of questions that were just insightful and sort of incredible based on just an initial sort of reading of the book, The Young and the Digital. But one of the final questions that he asked me was, you know, how did I make the transition from my interest in hip-hop culture to sort of digital media culture. And what I tried to explain to him is that in some ways I saw any number of parallels there, right? That my interest in hip-hop culture was always about sort of understanding how young people were creating with technology, right? How they were sort of using the symbolic materials and resources around them to build a world that otherwise simply could not have existed. So the way in which the DJ took those turntables and turned them into a kind of percussive instrument, the ways in which graffiti artists took those aerosol cans and sort of used them, right, as the paintbrush and used the city landscape literally as their canvas to sort of express their identity as a way to make their mark on the city landscape. I oftentimes joke, right, that rap music and hip hop were actually mobile before being mobile. And we know how young people use that boombox, right, as a way to claim a space that otherwise, right, was not for them to claim. And if you remember, a sort of perfect illustration of this, right, is the movie, Spike Lee's movie, Do the Right Thing, when radio rushes into the pizzeria with that boombox, how it literally sort of reorients that environment and transforms it in ways that sort of leads to sort of racial chaos. But this is how young people use mobile media. This is how they use mobile technology as a way to sort of navigate the world around them, as a way to sort of navigate the sort of authoritative regimes that they oftentimes find themselves confronting and dealing with. Hip hop has always had a sort of do-it-yourself kind of aesthetic and ethic to it. Again, sort of using a space of leisure, a space of personal expression that otherwise does not exist. So turning parks and street corners right into their own club and into their own block party was a sort of long sort of standing part of sort of the early origins of hip hop culture. Hip hop has always been about sort of a peer-based learning environment. You didn't learn how to do the things that young people were doing through hip hop culture in any kind of formal learning environment. And in fact, many historians of hip hop argue that because there weren't opportunities for kids to express themselves in public schools, that they used street corners, that they used public parks, that they used subway trains as a way to sort of teach each other how to express themselves, how to create art, how to write, how to think, in some ways, how to act in this world. And one of the things that we always knew when we started studying hip hop about 10, 12, 15 years ago is that hip hop was always more than just about rap music. Always more than just about the lyrics, right? Whether those lyrics were positive or negative. There was usually the debate when we first started thinking seriously about what hip-hop culture meant. We understood something else was at stake here. We understood that hip-hop in some ways, right, represented a very important sort of generational and dispositional shift among a certain a segment of young people. That in many respects, hip-hop was not only about how young people saw the world, but it was also, not about seeing the world, but also about how they were being in the world as well. And how they were, again, using the landscape and using the resources at their sort of disposal to create and make spaces for themselves that, again, otherwise simply would not have been there because they weren't provided. And of course, hip-hop has always been sort of participatory, right? It's never been just about kids buying the music, right? It's never been about what corporate America has tried to sort of shove down their throats in terms of how it has packaged hip-hop, but about the ways in which they sort of create, the ways in which they participate, always sort of blurring that line between who's performing and who's consuming. And in many respects, right, that's what we're seeing today in digital media youth culture. So it wasn't sort of surprising to us in the long run that hip-hop would be such a central aspect and sort of thematic and sort of aesthetic element in the ways in which young African Americans and Latinos were articulating their identities and claiming a space for themselves in the digital world. And so what I'd like to do is just give you just a few examples of some of the things that we are beginning to observe, some of the things that we are beginning to learn as we sort of talk with young people about their involvement in the digital media landscape, as we begin to observe and even in some instances participate in that world with them. One of the things that has also kind of sort of struck us as quite interesting and intriguing are the ways in which young Black and Latinos sort of create and carve out a space for themselves. Right? Henry mentioned earlier, right, that part of this conference is about understanding how different formations of social capital, how different expressions and accumulations of cultural capital play out in the digital media space. And we certainly see this in the case of Black and Latino youth, right? Prudence Carter, for example, in her work talks about Black youth cultural capital, a really fascinating study of how Black youth and their cultural capital, that is, the sort of linguistic practices that they master, the sort of taste cultures that they master, the sort of dress and style that they participate in and express, how that in many instances sort of comes into conflict, right, with their teachers at school, with the sort of authorities at school, and creates, if you will, a sort of clash of culture and identities that makes school, unfortunately, right, a place where many of them prefer not to be, and oftentimes sort of underperform, despite the fact that they really have wonderful skills and incredible insights that contribute to those environments in some pretty amazing kinds of ways. What we noticed, right, in terms of how Black youth was sort of managing themselves in digital media spaces, where we would go to MySpace and immediately, right, we would be greeted obviously by rap music, by the music videos that they were loading, but also, and equally important, right, by the pictures of themselves and their peers that they were posting and how they were playing out, right, some of this own sort of hip-hop fantasies and some of their own sort of hip-hop identities, and how they were using those profiles in some ways kind of as a mirror, right, to enact certain kinds of identities, to share those with their peers, and in some ways kind of modify those as necessary. And it was quite interesting also to sort of look at the ways in which the sort of casual kind of language, right, and sort of linguistic practices that they've kind of mastered, and the ways that they take English, right, and sort of modify it in ways that sort of speak to them. And we know that cultural capital is not something that only the middle class and the affluent have, but the cultural capital is social, it's contextual, and it's specific, right, to unique environments. And so for these young people, right, certain repertoires of knowledge, certain ways of being in the world become very important in terms of surviving their environment, in terms of sort of achieving a certain degree of status and prestige in their environment. And so certain kinds of knowledge-based communities sort of take shape and form here that are very important to them, a sense of community, a sense of belonging. The ways in which they do race and gender in these spaces is quite fascinating, and the ways in which they perform that in relation to hip-hop is also quite striking as well. In the 1990s, a group of urban sociologists, right, all over the country sort of began to start trying to answer one sort of what they thought was a very perplexing and intriguing question. And that is, why was it that young African Americans, and in particular young black men, were having difficulty finding and sustaining meaningful levels of employment, right? And there were all of these sort of theories about, you know, is there some kind of spatial mismatch hypotheses going on here? Are there other kinds of things going on? And so they started going out and interviewing, right, employers and people who were making these sort of hiring decisions in, near, and around the sort of urban environments and communities where young African Americans tended to live. And one of the things that they found out, right, is that this notion of soft skills, right, emerged as a really sort of interesting sort of strike against young black men in particular. Soft skills being, for example, let me just tell you what hard skills are and how that sort of differs from soft skills. Hard skills, right, might be literacy, numeracy, right, skills, the kinds of things that you could put down, for example, on a resume, right, and sort of build out your profile that way. But soft skills are more subjective and interpretive, right? They may be the way in which one talks or communicates. It may be the way in which one sort of interacts with others. It may be demeanor, right, one's form of presentation. And what the researchers found, right, is that the soft skills are just as important and just as crucial in terms of why young African Americans couldn't find meaningful employment, because most of the employers thought, well, the way that they spoke, the way that they behaved, the sort of intimidating presence, in some ways, right, become. And so researchers begin to talk about the need for young African Americans to code switch, right? So that maybe how you were, you know, on the street corner with your partners may be very different from how you would behave when you walked in to do an interview. And being able to sort of code switch and perhaps, you know, present yourself in a slightly different manner. How you communicated, how you dressed, how you behaved. And those kinds of things I think are quite interesting, and in some ways sort of parallel what we're seeing in the digital world. We know, for example, right, that increasingly colleges and universities, when they make admissions decisions, are looking at Facebook profiles, are looking at MySpace profiles. I hear every day from colleagues, I hear every day from people that we work with, teachers, principals, that these are things that they're doing too, right? Principals tell me pretty much now, any decisions they make about hiring is based in part, right, on their observation of what people are doing in MySpace, or more recently, what people are doing in Facebook. And I mention this, right, because as you begin to look at the profiles and the ways in which young African Americans are performing in these sort of digital media spaces, this notion of soft skills in the digital realm are something that I think we need to start developing a conversation about. In other words, the sort of linguistic practices, right, that they sort of perform in these spaces, the things that they talk about, the way in which they talk about them. You know, if an employer or admissions officer looks at these profiles and sort of follows them along, right, they're likely to be turned off, right, likely to be intimidated, likely to perceive, right, that these are expressions, these are styles of behavior that simply don't fit in. And one of the things that I've sort of come to the conclusion of is that what young African Americans and Latinos lack in many instances, right, are those both informal and formal forms of education about what's at stake in terms of their participation in the digital world. And maybe we can talk a bit more about that later. The other thing that we've also been noticing are the ways in which Black and Latino youth are both not only creating with digital media content, but also critiquing with digital media content as well, and creating and sort of participating in learning communities and new forms of literacy that sort of facilitate and encourage, right, a kind of dynamic engagement, dynamic conversations. And some of the examples I want to share with you here about race and place, for example, about the relationship between race and geography, and how that sort of disproportionately impacts the quality of their lives, how that shapes the quality of their lives in some very important kinds of ways. Here are just a couple of pictures. After Hurricane Katrina, and a number of families sort of evacuating. A lot of sort of, pediatricians and social workers working with very young children thought that it was important and even necessary for young children to be able to talk about, to write about, to draw about their experiences, both before Katrina, during Katrina, and sort of post-Katrina. And these are some examples of just some of the pictures that young children were drawing in terms of how they were sort of grappling with, how they were articulating their own experiences through that sort of epic storm. One of the things that we sort of came across in some of the work that we've been doing in Texas is that we've encountered, teenagers and young 20-somethings who also evacuated New Orleans in the aftermath of that storm. And what we found was particularly interesting are the ways in which, for them, digital media has become the site, has become the platform, has become the space in which they grapple with their own anxieties, their own fears, but also their own hopes about what their lives might be like in the sort of post-Katrina experiences that they have. One young man that we met in a series of interviews that we were doing about 2 or 3 years ago, and we had no idea that this was about to happen, but he was a part of that sort of, trail of families and individuals who sort of evacuated after the storm. And he told us about how in New Orleans, he never used MySpace. And back then it was all about MySpace for this group, for this community. We'll talk a little bit about how they've shifted to other platforms more recently. But back then it was all about MySpace. That was all they cared about. That was all they participated on. But he said, I always sort of thought it was a waste of time. And as he began to talk more and more about, his life after Katrina, digital media began to play a very different kind of role in his life. And what he told us was, for example, I always thought that MySpace was a waste of time, but it's important for me now, especially after Katrina or whatever. Like all of my friends got scattered over the US, I found like 2 of them through MySpace. And they began to start talking about how through MySpace he was able to sort of reconnect with his friends, to sort of reconnect with those peers. We know, for example, that for young teens, right, that the peer network is crucial, right, in terms of their sense of who they are, the communities that they build, the people that they trust, the sort of social capital that they develop, the cultural capital that they develop. So just imagine for them to be sort of literally in a span of a day or two, to be torn away, right, from those sort of comfort zones that they sort of experience, their networks, their peers, their friends, their allies, their partners, homies. For them, right, it was a very traumatic experience. And so these environments became a way in which they not only sort of sought each other out, but also, as we learned, began to start expressing their own sort of anxieties, again, their own kinds of concerns, but again, their own sort of hopes and aspirations about what their lives may be like in the aftermath of Katrina. Earlier this year, in January, we came across a young woman whose family was preparing to go back to Louisiana. They decided not to go to New Orleans because they decided that New Orleans was not quite ready for them, right? That despite all of the euphoria about the New Orleans Saints winning the Super Bowl and New Orleans on the recovery, for a lot of families, right, that simply is not the reality. So instead, her family elected to go back to Baton Rouge. But before she left, right, where she was currently living in Texas, she made a little post on her Facebook page. And here's what she said. She sort of channeled the popular rapper today, Lil Wayne. Excuse my language, but why would a nigga go to New Orleans? This is Katrina land. The president flew over, and he ain't even land. And what we found really interesting about that is that about 4 or 5 of her friends in Facebook, right, sort of commented. And what sort of ensued was this sort of interesting conversation, right, about the lack of the recovery effort in New Orleans, about racism, right, about geography, and about the ways in which these young people were trying to make sense of their own experiences in these kinds of environments. Here's another sort of, this was a kind of a fan page, I guess, if you will, but really more of a public memorial that some young Austinites created after the first murder of 2010 was young Justin Mendez. And they created a Facebook page with about 600 people who've signed up for it now. And as we began looking at that, right, these people leaving comments, leaving sort of remarks, sort of their ways of sort of not only remembering this young man and his life, and sort of acknowledging his existence and acknowledging his impact in their lives, and sort of expressing their condolences to his family. But what also sort of ensued, right, in these comments, right, and in these sort of engagements and conversations through Facebook was ideas and thoughts and perspectives about race and about geography and about violence. And what I want to suggest here, right, is going, again, back to this living and learning with new media report, we oftentimes, it's sort of easy to kind of dismiss what young people are doing in these spaces, right? It's sort of wasting time. But the ways in which they're sort of reimagining, right, what these technologies and what these spaces may mean for them. And we know, right, that they bring not only particular kinds of cultural competencies, not only certain kinds of skills, not only certain kinds of interests in terms of their engagement, but they bring certain life experiences too, right? And how these life experiences in some way shape and inform their participation in the digital world is something that I think we're just now really beginning to gain a sort of better understanding of. And here's one quote, and toward the end here, I sort of highlighted what this young woman had to say. But any number of quotes like this, right, about how this was a senseless murder, why are our communities like this, why are we doing this to each other, really sort of interesting sort of dialogues and sort of civic-minded sort of conversations about life in the hood from their perspective. I mentioned, right, that some of this most recent activity was in Facebook, right? So if we were doing this conference just 2 or 3 years ago, the likelihood of these kinds of conversations within this community of young people happening in Facebook weren't very great, right? Sort of thinking about that sort of, as she puts it, controversial essay that Dana Boyd wrote a few years ago about the ways in which class divisions play out in different kinds of computer-mediated spaces. She was talking specifically about MySpace and Facebook and the ways in which class and race began to sort of, at least in some way, shape and inform the kinds of choices and decisions in terms of that people make in terms of which channels, which populations, which communities they're likely to participate in. We were also beginning to notice similar kinds of trends and similar kinds of developments in some of the work that we were doing. And right around the time that Dana had released that essay, was also right around the time that Esther Hargitay from Northwestern had released a study where she had surveyed a group of college students, and she saw similar kinds of patterns too, where white and Asian students were overwhelmingly sort of using Facebook. Latino, and to some degree black, but especially Latino students, a significant number of them still had a preference for MySpace. And so this whole conversation has ensued about the ways in which these computer-mediated spaces sort of play out in the digital media world, and in particular race and class. Some of you may be aware of this recent series of data that the Facebook team released where they begin to make the case that over the last 2 years, Facebook has in fact become more racially and ethnically diverse, that in terms of black and Latino participation and involvement, it at least is beginning, right, to sort of match the general sort of presence in terms of the overall U.S. population. I mentioned that some of the work that we were doing was also kind of echoing some of the work that Dana and some of the work that Esther was doing. And we came up with this sort of notion of kind of digital gating. And it was inspired in part by some of the interviews that we were conducting. So just to give you a sense of what we were doing, we collected a huge survey, about 1,000, at this time about 700. But we were also doing kind of follow-up interviews, in-depth interviews with young students. And in particular, we were doing a set of interviews with young white college students. And the language that we were hearing, we thought was quite striking. And the migratory patterns that we were witnessing, we thought were also kind of unique as well. At this time, right, about 3 or 4 years ago, many white students, as they were moving from high school to college, were also moving from MySpace to Facebook. Today, of course, right, they're just starting out with Facebook and for the most part, not really bothering with MySpace that much these days. But the language that they were using, we thought was particularly striking. MySpace was trashy. Facebook was clean. MySpace was crowded. Facebook was selective. MySpace was uneducated. Facebook was college educated. MySpace was this, Facebook was that. And as we began to start thinking about the language, I started just reading, right, some of the work of cultural anthropologists who studied the whole gated community phenomena in the United States. And the language, right, was quite similar. And I was sort of struck by that in terms of the language that residents of gated communities were using and how it was quite similar to the language that young white students were using in terms of their migratory patterns and their move from MySpace to Facebook. And this idea, right, that for them, MySpace represented what we call the sort of digital undesirables. And Facebook represented a much more desirable population. A lot of complex issues going on there in terms of how, in some ways, the transition from MySpace to Facebook was kind of a digital upgrade in terms of status, in terms of community, in terms of network, in terms of lifestyle. And those are the kinds of things that we wanted to try to understand. We were also reading Bill Bishop's work, The Big Sort, where he talks about how communities in America, it's not just about red state and blue state, but he talks about even how neighborhoods and communities now are being sorted around political ideology, right, around values and lifestyle. And we thought that this in some ways was being sort of replicated in the digital world in some ways that we should certainly be mindful of. More recently, the decision by young African Americans and Latinos to use Facebook, I think, is sort of quite interesting, and we can talk about at least some of the strategies there. I think one of the things that we haven't done a great job of doing is sort of trying to demarcate and sort of identify, right, those factors that sociologists refer to as kind of push and pull in terms of how we migrate, in terms of how people migrate. What are those factors that push young blacks and Latinos from certain spaces and pull them towards certain other kinds of spaces? And those are the kinds of things that we've been trying to do. So when we sort of ask young people about their engagement with MySpace, about their decisions with Facebook, the things that we were hearing 3 and 4 years ago are very different than the things earlier, right, that 3 years ago was all about MySpace, right, for these young black and Latino teens. MySpace was cool, MySpace was fun, you could do all kinds of things in MySpace, you could create and customize your own platform. As one young person told us, MySpace is awesome-tastic. And so in that sense, right, they were just sort of captivated by all of the things that they were able to do. When we asked them about Facebook 3 years ago, right, these young black and Latino students, you know, Facebook was boring, Facebook was nerdy, Facebook was for college students. In one of the focus groups that we did, we had a young white student, right, who participated. One of his friends was in the group, and he heard what we were doing, was very excited, and said, could he participate? We said, sure, come along. Very colorful young man, very bright. And at one point, I looked at him and I asked, so what do you think about about Facebook? And he looked at me and he said, it's too white. And so in that sense, sort of thinking about the ways in which they were also sort of racializing, right, and typing these different spaces. But fast forward just 2 or 3 years later, right, and they have a very different attitude and a very different perspective about how they are participating in the digital world. MySpace is now tired. MySpace is now played out. And while many of them are still active in MySpace, they're also active in Facebook as well. And Facebook has become, at least for them, right, an opportunity from the perspective of some, right, to sort of leave some of the drama, some of the anxiety that's played out in MySpace. I think in some ways it's kind of a digital upgrade, but it's also a recognition, right, of always trying to keep in step with what's happening in the digital world. And they're quite savvy about this. Let me end by talking a little bit about what I call the mobile paradox. You know, when we started doing these focus groups and interviews with young Latinos and African Americans, you know, the mobile phone was always nearby, right? And they were never disrespectful with it, but occasionally quickly. And we had problems with that, right? Because we always tell them, right, when we're working with them, you know, don't change who you are for us, right? We want to see you as you are. We want to interact with you as you are. So just do whatever you would do because that's what we want to see. And so we just began to start observing, and we would ask them, right, can we take pictures of your phones? And more recently, here's some of the pictures that we've been capturing, right? And as we started doing this, right, I would look at their phones and just how sophisticated and how sharp their phones were. I'd oftentimes look at my phone and sort of push mine out of view. And they have certainly kind of forced me to upgrade my mobile game just by watching and sort of interacting with them. But what's turned up is that for them, mobile has become a kind of multifaceted platform and experience, right? As Kaiser mentions, right, they're using their mobile devices increasingly for phones. I mean, they sort of help to create the industry of ringtones. They're also using their phones for gaming. They're using their phones to watch video. They're doing a variety of different things. But increasingly, they're telling us they're also using their phones to access the internet, that it is in fact becoming their preferred destination for accessing the internet. And some interesting sort of developments I think are occurring there in terms of this kind of mobile paradox that I want to talk about. Just one young man, he was sort of double loaded. He had a phone in one pocket and his iPod in the other pocket. And he was able to sort of swiftly just kind of move back and forth between both. Pew sort of reported last year that African Americans, more so than their white counterparts, for example, are significantly more likely to go online via a handheld mobile device, right? So they reported, right, that they're less likely to go online via a desktop computer, even less likely to go online via a laptop, and increasingly, right, are more likely to go online via their mobile device. A really sort of interesting development. Some of you may have followed the launch of Apple's iPad just a few weeks ago. And one of the points that Steve Jobs kept making, right, is that the iPad, is like holding the internet in your hand. And as I was listening to him and thinking about that, I was like, you know, young black kids are already holding the internet in their hands. And so in some respects, they are sort of occupying a position that I don't think we've necessarily ever associated with them. And that is the position of kind of an early adopter. We typically associate early adopters with being male, with being white, with being college educated and affluent. And so this in some ways, right, sort of turns that narrative literally upside down and on its head. But as I begin to start thinking about this, right, they're not only early adopters, but in some ways they're also resilient adopters. In other words, right, if you look at, for example, the growth of broadband in American households, for whites the growth is still somewhat steady, inching upwards. For Latinos, it's inching upwards at a fairly rapid clip and pace. But for African American households, broadband is sort of stymied for some reason. We're not quite sure why. And so for many black youth, what we're hearing from them, right, is that the opportunities to do the kinds of things that they want to do online from home, right, are very much limited. So there may be a computer at home, and in many cases, a computer is present, but it may not be operable. It may need repair. You know, broadband may not be available. It may be here for some time, then it's cut off for a certain period of time. So in terms of reliable access, right, in terms of what I call, a much more sort of empowered access, they're increasingly relying upon their personal mobile devices to do that. And so in that sense, they represent not only kind of an early adopter category, but something that I think is quite interesting and perhaps unique as far as they're concerned, but sort of resilient adopters. In other words, they are adopting and sort of using mobile technology in part, right, because they want to. And in part because they recognize what other young people recognize with mobile technology is that it gives them a certain degree of autonomy and freedom and emancipation from adult authority that young people of all generations have always sought. But it's also in part because they have, this is sort of their alternative, right? We know, for example, right, that the spaces that are oftentimes available to them in terms of how we close that sort of that technology access gap, putting computers on the internet in school, putting computers in the internet in libraries and community technology centers. But those spaces oftentimes come with the restrictions and rules about what they can do, about how much time they can spend on the computer. And so in many instances, right, they talk about the ways in which they feel sort of surveilled in those spaces and in those environments, and how these mobile personal devices allow them, right, a much more kind of empowered access. And in fact, Mimi, over the years, and some of her colleagues have talked about the ways in which young people across the world, right, are using mobile technologies as a way to kind of remake these sort of geometries of power that they find in their lives. And for young African Americans and Latinos, the way those geometries of power play out are quite unique and quite distinct in terms of how their bodies are policed in school, how they're policed in shopping malls, how they're policed in streets and just throughout the sort of public sphere. And so for them, mobile becomes a much more empowered type of space. It also becomes a space in which they can begin to sort of maneuver around and negotiate and sort of resist some of these ways in which they are surveilled, some of these ways in which they are restricted, some of these ways in which they are policed. So let me end just by sort of on a curvature of a couple of question marks. So as I begin to start thinking about, and this is, I think this whole sort of mobile thing is something that's fairly recent. Pew also reports, right, that young blacks and Latinos are beginning to sort of lead the way in terms of the young people who are now coming onto Twitter. And the kinds of things that they're doing with Twitter is something that we are just now really just beginning to identify, let alone understand. But in terms of this sort of march to the mobile web, this sort of migration to the mobile web, I do think that there are some issues at stake that we should at least mark out, put on the table, and begin to start thinking about. One of the things that has sort of struck me about the work that we've been doing with young blacks and Latinos is that they're oftentimes doing these kinds of digital media practices virtually with no sort of adult supervision or engagement, right? On the one hand, I sort of understand, like most young people, right, sort of escaping sort of adult authority and having a greater degree of freedom and emancipation to do the kinds of things that they want to do. But it's also sort of interesting to think about the important role that adults, teachers, parents play in young people's digital lives. So as young people sort of migrate further and further away from those opportunities to have meaningful conversations with teachers and with parents and with other adults about their participation in the digital world, I do think that there are some very real issues at stake here. The other thing that I wonder is what do we know about the mobile web, and in particular how young blacks and Latinos are participating in the mobile web? You know, are they using it for entertainment and recreational purposes? Are they using it for these greater forms of sociability that we know that they've done with other kinds of platforms, particularly the computer and social network sites? But are there other kinds of things that they may be missing out on, other kinds of experiences that they may be missing out on, more interest-driven kinds of experiences, more geeked-out kinds of experiences that the Living and Learning report talks about. And so in that sense, beginning to try to think about the ways in which there are certain kinds of possibilities happening in this space, and the ways in which they are remaking the participation gap, but there are also certain perils that we must also be aware of. And I'll end with that and sort of open it up for questions.
Well done. Give us proud. All right, so I'm moderating, and can take some questions for Craig. So, and you're going to run mics, is that?
Yeah.
So, there's a hand down here and one up there, I'm seeing, and the one down here is straight here. So, yeah, go on up there, and we'll start with the one that's got a mic. Just tap the bottom of the mic, and
Is the red? Okay. Hold on.
All right, we'll do the one in the back, and we'll work on getting this one in front to work.
Fascinating work. Can you tell me, in any of your work with mobile phones and the use in the urban population, are they exploring QR codes or augmented reality experiences, or are they not yet getting access to those?
In terms of the young people that we've been talking to, there hasn't been any indication that they're migrating to those types of experiences. And that's part of what I was sort of asking is I'm not sure if we really sort of fully know what types of experiences they're seeking out via these sort of mobile tools and technologies. So we know they're there, we know they're using them, and we know that increasingly, they are sort of investing in them. But in terms of, how rich the engagement, how rich the experiences are, that I think hasn't really successfully or effectively been documented. And that's part of what I was asking too is, does their migration to the mobile web, does it afford them, certain kinds of opportunities and experiences in the digital world that might lead to those kinds of opportunities or lead to those kinds of experiences? It very well may be that it does, but my suspicion, at least in terms of some of the early things that we're beginning to hear, we're not getting a sense, that's happening, though. I wouldn't be surprised to learn as we continue to do this work further that some of those types of activities, some of those degrees of engagement are certainly happening.
All right, let's try that again down here.
Great, thank you. In Los Angeles, I've noticed that broadband access is directly related to the ethnic makeup of particular neighborhoods, and I don't know if you've seen that in other cities as well, but it's been a huge frustration for those of us who are there. Do you think that youth, particularly Latino and African American youth, moving to mobile phones has been out of necessity because they can't get access any other way?
Yeah, and that's part of what I was trying to articulate. That I think that's part of the paradox, and part of the resiliency on their part, right? And so in other words, because the dependability of it at home, for example, is not there, they have rather than just give up, right? Or rather than just ignore that world, they have figured out, this alternative pathway to participating, right? It's via their mobile devices. And again, they oftentimes talk to us about, either the fact that broadband isn't available in their homes, or it's intermittently available, or the technology or the hardware that's there is not really upgraded in such a fashion that allows them to do the kinds of things that they want to do in terms of a richer, more meaningful type of participation in the digital world. And I do think that's part of the paradox. Part of this, right, I think, is voluntary, right? That it is a preferred option. But I think part of it is also shaped and influenced by lack of other kinds of opportunities as well.
Okay.
Hi. Okay, good. So thanks. It was a really interesting talk. So one of the things that I've been reading a lot about and looking at is the use by law enforcement and other kinds of sources of authority in schools and other places to enforce legal and rule-based behaviors on social networking sites, using social networking sites. There's been a huge explosion of police investigations. And so I was interested, you talked about the use of mobile and the mobile web as a way to kind of escape from other physical constraints on African American youth and Latino youth. And I was wondering if you ran across anything there where as there might be an increased presence, or are these kids aware? Is it having any effect? Just kind of curious about that.
Yeah, and I think that's an interesting question, and part of what I didn't talk about here today, but I think I made reference to it. I mean, a lot of what we're seeing in terms of the Black and Latino youth, and I should have prefaced this earlier. The Black and Latino youth that I'm referring to are primarily from kind of working class, stable, not so stable, kind of lower middle class, poor neighborhoods and households. And I think that distinction is important because, the experiences of more middle class and affluent Black and Latino youth may be very different. But what we're seeing in terms of the working class and poor youth is, I'm not sure that the level of education and information in terms of equipping them with the tools and with the skills to be more savvy about how they participate in the digital world is really happening. In other words, much of their engagement and much of their participation in terms of what we're seeing is usually outside of the purview of parents, who in some cases have no idea what their kids are doing. I think there's much more of a generational gap problem amongst Black and Latinos than it might be, for example, with white youth and their parents. Some of the white youth that we meet and talk with, some of the schools that we visit, their parents are on Facebook. Their parents are using some of these tools and platforms. And so they're able to just to have conversations with their kids about these technologies and helping them to sort of navigate them in ways that might enable them or to empower them, to sort of understand that those kinds of issues that you articulated may be very much a part of their online experience. But, what happens in the case of homes and households where parents have no sense of what their kids are doing, or where parents themselves are not participating and simply are just not knowledgeable enough to have a sort of meaningful conversation with their children about their participation in the digital world. And so my sense is that they're operating and oftentimes participating in these spaces without necessarily a kind of recognition of what eyes are out there sort of watching and gazing and sort of surveying what they're doing. And I do think that those kinds of conversations, those forms of education, are something that need to be facilitated at a greater pace in certain communities and neighborhoods.
Okay, so we've got a mic down here, and then we'll go to the one up there, and then we'll...
Okay, so I also enjoyed, I'm in the front here. Right, so thanks. I enjoyed your talk quite a bit as well. And one of the things that struck me about it was the kind of a spatial metaphor that you used, which was the kind of digital media landscape, or you described the youth who occupy certain locations or push and pull or migratory patterns. And one of the things that makes me wonder about then is the idea about, well, as digital media producers, so engineers or cultural producers, then we also want to design for certain kind of practices, for certain kind of situated activities. And then, well, it's really hard to design for something like hip hop, right? To design for the DIY mentality, because it's grassroots, it's ground up, and there's a kind of literacy which comes from that DIY culture. And at the same time, it's maybe far too easy to design for the gated community culture. And so I wonder, what can we learn then as, say, design principles, knowing that our designs are going to be picked up in some kind of situated way by youth, so that, one, you can enable the kind of grassroots production so they can be literate in digital media the same way that they are in other media as producers as well. And then secondarily, ways to design to mitigate against the kind of gated community effect. So that's not taking it as a landscape that they move upon, but rather something that they're building, that we're building, that has particular affordances, that's situated in context.
Yeah, no, that's a really fascinating question, and sort of opens up just a whole world of possibilities in terms of how we think about how we would design spaces and experiences that might afford, right, these types of engagements and degrees of participation that you to. I mean, it's certainly, I think, kind of a challenging one, because I mean, talking about cultural capital and how it works in certain spaces and in certain communities. And so I think in some ways, I mean, so for these kids that we talk to, right, authenticity, right, is just keeping it real. It's just sort of a central aspect of who they are, right? They articulate it constantly, verbally, sort of behaviorally, just the ways in which they talk, the ways in which they perform. And so in some sense, right, trying to build and design spaces that they regard or sort of identify as authentic. And I know sometimes, I mean, that's very problematic in terms of how we define or how we think about authenticity. But I think in terms of trying to understand it through their lens is something that I think we have to begin to try to start doing that kind of work. How you develop, spaces, how you develop environments to sort of strike them, that sort of resonate with them in ways that they feel as if, right, these are spaces where they are welcome. These are spaces where they won't be judged. These are spaces where they won't be policed. I mean, I think that's part of what you're asking, and I think it's to be honest, I think it's a great challenge. But I think the beauty of what we're all doing here and the kinds of things that we're interested in, and I think the kind of work that MacArthur is interested in, is trying to figure that out, right? What might those spaces look like? What kinds of literacies are we talking about? What kinds of environments would we build? And what kinds of communities might form? And so in that regard, my sense is, right, is that the conversations that have been facilitated just via this initiative are designed in part, right, to begin to start pushing us in ways that we might begin to start thinking about that in more refined ways and in more purposeful kinds of ways.
Okay, in the back.
Hi. I just wanted to pick up on one of the words that you mentioned in the presentation, and that was the word empowered. And I'm curious relative to your work as to, because often we focus a lot on behaviour, what our youth are actually doing, being participants or engaging, or what they think and how they're learning, but not necessarily how they feel. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering from your work, you've come across or looked at anything that compares youth or profiles youth on how digital media actually makes them feel within this space.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. You know what? I mean, what I've seen, and when I go back and listen, we always sort of record, the interviews and the conversations that we conduct. In fact, I was just, sort of leading up to this event, I was listening to some things that were recorded about 2 or 3 years ago, and then listening to some of those same kids 2 or 3 years later. And what I hear in their voices, right, is a certain kind of enthusiasm, a certain kind of a kind of aspiration, right, that suggests to me that for them, these spaces and these technologies, have a pretty significant meaning in their lives. And they're, I mean, young people can be very dramatic in the language that they use, very dramatic in terms of how they talk about their relationship to these technologies. But I believe that they're generally sincere when they talk about how, I couldn't live without my mobile phone, or, we would ask them, for, what would happen if you woke up tomorrow and, and there was no MySpace. This is a question that we asked them 2 or 3 years ago. And just the sort of angst, right, that sort of, melts from their voices is sort of pretty incredible. But I do get the sense that, that they do feel sort of empowered in ways that we're trying to kind of acknowledge and recognize. And I guess what I mean by empowered is, from their perspective, right, and I think accurately so for the most part, they feel like they live in a world in which they are constantly being judged, again, constantly being policed and constantly being surveilled. Right? They talk about, what it's like to walk into a store or go into a shopping mall and be followed. In fact, a lot of people believe that a number of these sort of parental escort policies in shopping malls are designed in part, right, to sort of keep certain types of kids, out of the mall. And so I mean, this is the environment, right, that they have to sort of contend with. And I think what we've tried to understand and what we're beginning to learn is how these spaces create, right, an environment where they sort of, at least they feel free of that. Whether they are or not may be a whole nother matter. But the sense that they feel like these are places where they can be themselves. These are places where they don't have to police their language or their style of communication and be judged or sort of degraded for the ways in which they express themselves. And so in that sense, right, they derive a great sense of I think, of power, a great sense of self-esteem, sort of belonging and community that's quite important to them. And I think this is something, that we begin to try to start sort of documenting more and more in the work that we're doing.
Okay, there's someone down here who's got a mic, and then, oh,
yeah.
Mimi.
Thanks, Craig. That was great. I really appreciated particularly your laying out some of the kind of emerging promises and perils of the mobile space, and it was fascinating. I mean, it's just an incredibly important space to be thinking about, both from a research perspective and also from a technology design and an educational perspective, I think. And, just from my own work, a long time ago now with teenage girls in Japan, mm-hmm. and this tendency for mobile to become a space for kids who have been shut out of a lot of the mainstream structures of ownership of space and power and computer access, and turning necessity into opportunity in a lot of ways. But at the same time, having been ghettoized in their own way as girly, friendship culture and texting culture for quite a long period of time before it turned into mainstream culture. And I think right now we're at a very different moment in mobile, where it has crossed generational and gender lines, and the opportunity structure is very different, right? So what kids can do on mobile is very different. It's not just about, the social friendship-driven side. There's really an opportunity to scaffold that access into the more geeked out, what we call the more geeked out activities. And, one of the things that I was just interested in hearing a little bit more of your thoughts and speculations about, I guess, and it's come up in some of the questions already, is what is that opportunity structure for the population of kids that you're looking at? I mean, do you see spaces of opportunities, particularly, hip hop is such a great example of what urban youth can do with a particular kind of spatial opportunity structure, appropriating elements of culture and space in really creative ways, evidencing a kind of resourcefulness and savviness about the use of technology and social media that you don't see among, the traditional geeked out populations that we associate with technology, or with the sort of overscheduled middle class families that don't have that opportunity and the opportunity to experiment in quite the same ways that I think, certain populations of urban youth do. And I'd really be interested in, we have, I think, here a diverse community of people who are doing research, who are doing technology development, and people who see themselves as practitioners in education. And I think this is kind of a, ripe space for us to be thinking about how we can work together to imagine new possibilities.
Was that a question?
I just wanted.
Your voice is supposed to go up at the end, Mimi, so that we can tell it's a question.
Your imagination about that possibility.
Yeah, I think you're right. Part of this whole sort of paradox thing, again, is about, how this population and this sort of resiliency, is in some ways a bit ahead of where some of us might be in terms of how we use technology, who we, again, typically associate with sort of early adopter type status and even prestige. Even the Pew Internet and American Life, Future of the Internet, I think version 3 says that by 2020, right, most Americans will be going online via their mobile device. And so we're meeting these kids, right, 16, 17, and 18-year-olds, living in sort of poor and working class neighborhoods who are already doing this. And I think, Mimi, your question sort of suggests, what does this provide us in terms of opportunities, right, for engagement, for empowerment, for participation, and that's part of what I sort of tried to speculate about as well, and I tried to end my comments kind of on a couple of question marks about so what's at stake as these kids migrate further and further to the mobile space and to the mobile web, and I do think that the possibilities are quite bright. But some of the things that we also hear suggest, right, that there are clear perils that we should be mindful of as well. In a recent group that we were meeting with, this issue of sexting, came up, and it's very real, and it's happening in their schools. And in fact, what we're hearing is that it's in some cases quite common, right? It's become part of the whole sort of courtship ritual culture for some young people. And I think most of us have sort of recognized, right, that there's some things that are quite sort of problematic and troubling about the ways in which these, young people and their young bodies are sort of being used, in this particular space. So I think the possibilities are certainly there. What I wonder about out loud is, as young blacks and increasingly Latinos and others as well, but in this case thinking about young blacks and Latinos, what does the mobile web mean for them, right? Is it, what kind of space is it for them? Is it primarily sort of recreational and entertainment based? Is it some of these other forms of sociability that you and others have talked about? Is there any evidence that they're also using these technologies, right, to have these kinds of opportunities for creating and critiquing as well, which suggests, at least for me, right, a very different level and type of engagement that's much more promising and suggests, right, some civic opportunities there. And I think these are the kinds of questions, these are the kinds of investigations that we need to begin to start developing.
All right, well, thank you very much, Craig, for an extraordinary presentation. So I am now to turn the floor over to Heather Hulst, and if you're in this room, it's because Heather helped facilitate in one way or another the processing of your paper, the acceptance of your paper, the organization of logistics, and she's got some more logistics to help us with. So let's thank Heather and welcome her up here.
Okay, thank you, and thank you to everyone for being patient as this, conference has actually doubled in size, and we're trying to sort of grapple to accommodate you. I've just heard that we might be moving tomorrow one of the smaller room presentations all day to a larger room, so check the board when you come in tomorrow. because we're sort of maxed out on space. So we'll let you know as things go. Check the registration desk and everything. I think immediately after this, we have our reception, which is right out in the atrium area. That'll be, well, it's now from 7:45 until about 9:30. We have a shuttle going back to the hotels at 8:45, and then another one at about 9:30-ish. We'll hold it for a couple minutes if people are delayed. We do have a sort of a hashtag on Twitter, DML 2010, for those of you who tweet. And I also wanted to give, I know Sharon Ray, are you here? Is John Crawford in the room? I wanted to give Sharon the opportunity to speak just for a moment about her demo, which will be occurring in the theater at 8:30. So she's going to transform herself in a few minutes. So, do you want to just come here, or do you want this? Either one.
Just a quick announcement. Some of you may have already received this information when you arrived. We're doing a short performance, which is an interactive performance where you're using your cell phone. And if you want to participate with your cell phone, there's a very short registration process. And if you have your cell phone now, I can tell you what that is. You just have to text UCI to this number, and that number is 72648. Okay, so send UCI, doesn't matter which lowercase, uppercase, to 72648. And you'll receive a message back, and in that message back there'll be a question, if you can respond to the question, and we'll go from there in the performance. So 72648. Okay, that's all. I'll keep it that brief.
Yeah, and we'll leave these by
I can leave these.
First performance. Okay. Okay, so I think with that, there's plenty of us around with, we're all trying to wear our blue bands, our armbands. So anyone with an armband may have answers to your questions, directions to rooms, everything else. We look forward to seeing you over the next 2 days. So thank you.